How did one scene, which was meant to be one of the most iconic moments of the Hobbit films, turn into the most hated sequence of the entire trilogy? Today, join me as we answer this question by diving deep into Tolkien's lore and comparing the Hobbit book to the movie, specifically finding all the revisions, additions, and omissions that Peter Jackson made to the chapter Barrels Out of Bonds. And by the end of today's video, I think you'll have a better understanding of why this scene flopped harder than Bomber in a Barrel. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 7 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the Hobbit Edition. Before we get started, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from last episode. And if you want to be featured next, be sure to drop your thoughts below when you're done watching. Also, a big thank you to Jason, Joshua, and the rest of my incredible Patreon supporters who help make these videos possible each month. Per usual, I'm going to compare this very special scene in the movie to its corresponding chapter in the Hobbit book, and find every single difference across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, we need to refresh our memory on what actually happened during this sequence of scenes in the movie. So, picking up from where we left off in the last episode, we see our dwarves being captured by the Wood Elves, who are led by Legolas. Meanwhile, Bilbo uses the ring to sneak in after them without being seen by any of the elves. After the dwarves get locked up, we see Thorin talk with Thranduil, the king of the Woodland Realm. Thorin rejects Thranduil's offer to help, calling the Elven King out for not holding to his word all those years ago. Thranduil is obviously offended by this and sends Thorin away to rot in a cell, but Thorin knows there's still a hobbit on the loose who might be able to help save them. After this, we see a scene in which Thranduil tells Tauriel to not give his son Legolas hope for love. Tauriel then leaves the king and goes down to check on the prisoners, and she ends up talking with Kili and they flirt about the moon and stuff like that. Blah. Sometime later, we see Bilbo figuring out a way for the dwarves to escape, and after stealing the guards' keys, he goes and helps free them from their cells. Then he guides the dwarves deeper into the caves where the cellar is located, and he tells them to get inside the barrels. Thorin reinforces this command, and the dwarves reluctantly hop into their barrels. Bilbo then opens the trapdoor to let all of the barrels fall into the stream below, but he realizes that he has no way of getting out as the trapdoor closes. At this point, the elves have figured out that the dwarves have escaped their cells and started coming downstairs. Luckily for Bilbo, he falls through the trapdoor after backing far enough up, and he disappears right as the elves run into the cellar. We then get the one and only barrel scene that has made waves through the Tolkien fandom, pun intended. After the dwarves get stuck at the river gate, which the elves closed, Bolg and his orcs finally attack. The elves then turn their attention to the orcs, and this gives Kili the opportunity to climb out of his barrel and open the river gate to allow their barrels through. But during this heroic deed, he gets shot by an orc archer in the leg. Then there's a lot more fighting and action as they float along the rapids during the battle between the elves and the orcs. But eventually, the elves give up their chase and allow the barrels to continue on as they take an orc captive back to Thranduil. In the midst of this, the movie cuts to a brief scene of Gandalf and Radagast finding the tombs of the Nazgul empty. But then the movie quickly cuts back to the dwarves who run into Bard as they come to the shore. Balin talks to Bard, and eventually they strike a deal before being smuggled into Lake Town. And finally, the movie cuts back to Thranduil, Legolas, and Tauriel as they interrogate the orc that they captured. And the scene ends with Thranduil killing the orc, and then Legolas finding out that Tauriel left the kingdom to pursue the orcs that were chasing the dwarves. So now that we've refreshed our memories on these scenes, let's begin our analysis with our first 3 categories of characters, timeline, and location. First, our characters category has some quite impactful changes this week, although they are easily explained away. Legolas, Tauriel, Bard, and Bolg are not in these scenes. Obviously, Tauriel is completely made up and Legolas is real, but he isn't anywhere to be found in the Hobbit book. As for Bard and Bolg, they are in the Hobbit book, but they don't appear in this chapter. Also, I've mentioned this before, but Thranduil technically isn't named anywhere in the Hobbit book, and is only referred to as the Elven King. We later find out in Tolkien's other writings that the Elven King was named Thranduil, so it's not totally incorrect. The incorrect part is how much the movies involve Thranduil, when Tolkien gave him such a small role that he didn't even bother naming him. And speaking of small roles, Kili is nowhere near a main character in the books. Bomber probably has more speaking parts than Kili in the book, yet in the movies they turn him into a main character for the sake of the love triangle, which we'll see develop later. But anyway, moving into our timeline category, we have a change that is in a bit of a gray area. You see, technically in the book, they're imprisoned in Thranduil's dungeons for nearly a month. That's right, a whole month. Whereas in the movie, it seems like literally one day. It's a gray area because technically one could argue that they were in there for a month, but the movie just cut out all the extra time. It's just that, in my opinion, the movie doesn't give any sense of a passage of time, and the way that the moments fit together make you think that things happened back to back. For example, Tauriel speaks to Thranduil on the same day that the dwarves are captured. Then she leaves Thranduil and goes to speak to Kili, who mentions the party the elves are having. We then see Bilbo steal the keys from the guards and the butler as they get drunk because of said party. So it would be incredibly difficult for Peter Jackson to say, well, time did pass, but we just didn't show it, because this string of events in the movie really makes it seem like they were freed in the same day. But let me know what you think in the comments. Now finally, before we get to the plot changes, we need to address our location category, which only has two differences. First, the portcullis, which we see in the movie as the river gate, is technically inside the caves in the book. It's right where the trapdoor releases the barrels in the water, not a half a mile down the stream, but that's not such a big deal. The bigger location change is the addition of a whole new place that alters Tolkien's lore entirely, and that location is the High Fells of Rhudaur. Again, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but this is where Gandalf and Radagast go to find the Nazgul tombs. I've already addressed this in past episodes, but if you're new here, the Nazgul were never buried. Peter Jackson made up this location, and Gandalf never visits here in the book. If you want the full Dol Guldur timeline, you can check out that video on my channel to learn more. But for today, we need to keep things going as we head into our plot changes. Of course, I can't go word for word through the dialogue and conversations that take place, because obviously that would take forever. However, I'll try my best to point out all of the significant dialogue differences that affect the story. However, if you're wanting to relive these moments for yourself, I'd highly encourage you to check out the audiobooks on Audible. You can claim a free trial using my link in the description, which supports the channel and gets you one free audiobook. So if you'd like, grab The Hobbit and follow along with me every other week as I do this series. But anyway, that being said, let's dive into our plot changes. To start things off, we need to overlap with last episode a little bit and repeat that the dwarves don't get saved by the elves and then captured. In the book, the dwarves escape the spiders all on their own, making it to one of the elves' feasting areas from the night before. No elves are there, and the leftover magic scares off the spiders. The dwarves then fall asleep one by one from exhaustion, and it isn't until they awake and start walking through the woods that they encounter some elves who leap out and capture them. But just like the movie, Bilbo quickly slips away during this time. Next, Thorin isn't with the company when they get captured, as in the book, he got captured the night before. Remember from last episode how we talked about the feasting wood elves? Well, during the last feast that the dwarves saw, Thorin was the one who stepped into the light, and because of this, he was put under a spell, knocking him out. He missed out on the entire spider fiasco as he lay asleep on the forest floor. He then was captured by the elves and taken to the Elven King, who questioned him. When Thorin wouldn't answer any of his questions, the king put Thorin in a deep dungeon all by himself. Then that leads us into the next change, which is the fact that in the book, all of the other dwarves were also questioned by the king when they arrived in his palace. The king did not inform them of Thorin's arrival, so the entire company thought him dead or lost in the woods. Balin spoke for the rest of the company and was very blunt with the king as they all were starving and very grumpy. He said that they did nothing wrong and then asked if the spiders were the king's pets and if killing them made him upset. This comment greatly upset Thranduil, and he locked all of the dwarves away as well, each in a separate cell so that they could not speak to one another. They also were locked on a separate level from Thorin, so they still never met him. And now that our dwarves are locked up, this brings up an addition that the movie made, which is never in the books. Obviously, you probably know what I'm speaking of, because in the character section we mentioned that Tauriel is made up. Therefore, her flirting with Kili in the dungeon is completely fabricated for the film, and it won't be the last time that we have a change like that today. Next though, the movie removed Bilbo's month-long stay in the caves as he figured out a way to save Thorin's company. I know I mentioned it in the timeline changes already, but it is also a plot change because we don't hear any of the details about this waiting period. We read in the book that Bilbo wore the ring the entire time he was there, for fear that he would be caught if he ever removed it. He also writes that he would leave the palace every once in a while as the elves went out on hunts, but in the book we learn that the front gate is magical and those who enter cannot escape without the king's leave, nor can they enter. So Bilbo always made sure to exit and re-enter with the elves without being seen, for if he got locked out without them, he may never have been able to get in again. We read about how this was Bilbo's most miserable month so far in the journey, stealing food and drink each day to survive and hiding in the dark corners of the cave, as his shadow could be seen if he walked around in the light. Essentially, this whole month he experienced a small taste of what Gollum felt for hundreds of years. He barely slept, and he writes, "I am like a burglar that can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day." But eventually his luck did turn around, and that brings us to our next change, as after a couple of weeks he finally located the dwarves, which goes to show how massive Thranduil's palace was in these caverns, as it took weeks to find the cells where his friends were being kept. But as we know in the movies, Bilbo pretty much knows where they are immediately. In the book, we learn that it took him some time, but eventually he found each cell for the first 12 dwarves, which were all in separate parts of the palace. Then one day he heard some guards speaking about a different dwarf, separate from the 12, and Bilbo immediately knew that this had to be Thorin. So after finding Thorin, he spoke with him at length about their predicament, and Thorin told Bilbo to send word to each of the other dwarves, and so Bilbo did just that. Keep in mind, Thorin was not there the night before when Bilbo told the others about his ring, so this is also the first time that Thorin would have learned about Bilbo's magical ring. After all, when Bilbo started talking to him, he thought he was just hearing voices in his head from going insane, because Bilbo was still invisible. Obviously in the movie, the dwarves don't hear from Bilbo until he gets the keys and frees them, but in the book, as you can see, he has communication with them after finding that they're imprisoned. The message that Thorin told Bilbo to give was one of hope, essentially telling them not to share anything with the king about their travels or their goal, and that their incredible Mr. Baggins would help them get out. This of course put a lot of pressure on Bilbo, but once again he pulls through, as we'll soon see. However, before we get to the barrels themselves, I wanted to throw out another change here, which is related to some dialogue. Like I said, I don't often bring up dialogue changes unless they impact the story, and I think this one does, as when Thorin is talking to Thranduil in the movie, the Elven King immediately knows what his journey is. He knows that Thorin is going to reclaim the Lonely Mountain. But I want to make it clear that in the book, the Elven King does not know this, or at least he does not tell the reader that he knows this. He asks Thorin many questions, but they all come back to the same thing. What is your purpose in my realm? This gives off the vibe that the Elven King doesn't know who Thorin is or why he's traveling through Mirkwood. Obviously, this is different from the movie, which makes every character somehow fully aware of who this dwarf is and what he is doing, despite there being no means for quick communication in Middle-earth. I don't know why the movie makes it seem like everybody has iPhones in Middle-earth and they're just FaceTiming each other with this information and sending pictures of Thorin's face back and forth, as somehow everyone in the films recognizes Thorin by his face, which is impossible in the book, especially since Book Thranduil never betrayed Thorin's people back when Smaug attacked. Whereas in the prologue of the movie, we saw how Thranduil turned his back on them, which is a made-up moment. But anyway, I figured I'd mention that because this insider knowledge of Thorin's journey greatly alters the way that we look at Thranduil in the book versus the movie. I will say that in the Hobbit book, we get a brief amount of lore and history on the woodland elves, and we do learn that they often were a lot greedier for jewels in the mountains, specifically white gems. As we've already addressed in a previous episode, the part of the movie where Thranduil wants these white gems because they used to be his wives, who is now dead, is completely made up. But I think they got inspired for that movie moment from this part of the book, because Tolkien writes that the elves used to get along with the dwarves until they promised payment to the dwarves and never gave it to them. And like I said, Tolkien writes that the elves really like the white gems in the mountains. It's just a lot more vague in the book and isn't attached to a specific person or sentimental reason like they have Thranduil's wife in the movie. Anyway, next up we have another small change that I'm obligated to mention because it's my duty. And that is that Tauriel and Thranduil do not have a conversation about Legolas and how Thranduil doesn't want Tauriel to give his son false hope. Of course, that's all baloney. But now we come to the moment that you've all been waiting for, the Great Escape. Similarly to the movie, Bilbo finds out that there is a cellar, and that the front door isn't the only way out of the palace, as the elves have to transport wine and other goods to and from Lake Town through a trapdoor in the cellar. So one night, Bilbo steals the guard's keys after he and the butler get drunk, and he goes to free the dwarves. The first change we come upon with this escape is the demeanor of the dwarves themselves regarding Bilbo's plan. And unlike the movie, Thorin is also not happy about this. So in the book, after hearing the dwarves' grumblings and complaints, Bilbo tells them that is fine and that he can put them back in their jail cells, and then perhaps they'll escape another time if he feels so inclined to help them again. It's one of those really sassy moments from Bilbo that I really love, and it convinces the dwarves to go along with the plan, because obviously the idea of going back to jail doesn't excite them. So they all head down to the cellar, where they begin to execute Bilbo's plan of escaping in the barrels. But of course, there are a few differences with this sequence, which might reveal why Tolkien fans hate this movie version so much. And it all boils down to one thing really: the book version is boring. I don't mean that in a bad way, but as you'll soon see, Tolkien is a lot more realistic and logical, even in his own fantastical world. So here are all the changes regarding this iconic scene from the films. First, after returning to the cellar, Bilbo replaces the keys back on the guard's belt, because he feels bad for causing the elf so much trouble. He thinks that if the keys are still on the guard, it'll save the elf some explanations to the king and he might not get punished, which I think is a nice touch. The next change is the fact that the dwarves don't just get into barrels that are empty. They actually get stuffed into barrels with other goods, and Bilbo goes to each dwarf, packing them in as snugly as possible. Again, Tolkien was realistic even inside of his own wild stories, and he wanted to make it clear that the safest thing for them to do would be to fit tight inside the barrel so they wouldn't bounce around. And on top of that, Bilbo goes through and puts lids on each barrel, sealing them off. There are air holes so they can still breathe, but the tops of the barrels are closed and sealed with each dwarf inside. Bilbo himself, similarly to the movie, is not in a barrel, and we'll see how he survives later on. Another key change here is the fact that in the book, Bilbo doesn't pull a lever, causing the barrels to fall into the water below. You might be surprised to find out that the elves themselves toss the barrels into the water. That's right, just like in the movie, there was a feast occurring in the palace, and the elves were eager to finish their work so they could go up and party. Like they did regularly, the elves needed to send off some empty barrels to Lake Town for trade, and the butler, who was drunk on the table, was usually in charge of this. At the proper time, some elves came down to the cellar after the dwarves had been stuffed in the barrels and found the butler drunk. They laughed at him about it, as elves in Tolkien's work are often jolly and lighthearted, and they woke the butler up. They told him that they needed to send these barrels off and that they feel they're heavier than they're supposed to be. But the butler insisted that he did his work right, and the barrels there all needed to be sent and not to question the weight. So the elves opened the trapdoor and one by one tossed the barrels into the water. Once they were all tossed below, the elves raised the portcullis and allowed the barrels to flow down the river. Which brings up another change, and that is the fact that the elves were completely unaware of the dwarves' escape. In the movie, they find out, which leads to this epic chase scene in the river, but in the book, the elves are none the wiser to Bilbo's schemes. And by the way, Bilbo grabs onto one of the last barrels and gets tossed into the water without the elves ever knowing, because he's been wearing his ring this whole time. But unlike the dwarves, he is not inside the barrel, he is on top trying to hold on for dear life. So at least that is accurate to the movie. Unfortunately, it's hard to track the changes after this because frankly, everything about the scene is incorrect. There are no orcs chasing them, the elves don't even know they escaped, and the dwarves are sealed up tight in the barrels so they can't be seen or even fight anyone anyway. I think what irritates people most about this sequence in the film is really just how unrealistic it is. Like I said earlier, Tolkien had a way of crafting a fantastical world full of unimaginable things like magic and different races, but he was incredibly realistic when it came to physics itself. A fat dwarf bouncing down a hillside and popping out with weapons to kill a bunch of orcs, or an elf jumping onto the heads of a couple of dwarves who are floating down rapids in barrels is completely unrealistic. Similarly to how people get upset at Legolas's superhuman stunts in The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson did it again in The Hobbit. And on top of this being super unrealistic, it completely alters the story itself. As you've already seen, the book is drastically different. And on top of that, you've got the additional love story of Kili and Tauriel. I think the grievances kept adding up over time and just exploded out of fans during this scene. It's really the tipping point for a lot of people who were able to hang on until this moment, but after seeing the barrel scene, they just go, nope, I can't do it anymore. Now, because it's my duty, there are still a couple more changes that we need to address, because as you might have noticed, we haven't finished the scenes for today. The next change is a quick one, and that is the fact that, obviously, the whole scene of Gandalf going to the Nazgul's tombs is made up. Next, though, we come to the dwarves encountering Bard on the shore. This never happens in the book. In fact, the dwarves stay in their barrels overnight. After getting to the end of the stream, there were some people whose job it was to look out for the shipment and to rope the barrels together and prepare them for the next day's journey to Lake Town. Bilbo couldn't very well free the dwarves right then and there as they were surrounded by people, so he left the dwarves inside of the barrels and went into the woods to survive until the next day. Although his sneezing gave him away a few times and he had to run despite being invisible. But eventually the next day came and the dwarves are freed. How they're freed is a story for next episode. But for now, just know that Bard is never introduced in this chapter, and men working on the barges are some random no-names for now. And finally, to wrap up this episode, we have yet another additional scene, which is when Thranduil is interrogating the orc. This subplot is made up, and Thranduil doesn't appear again until later in the book. Of course, Tauriel and Legolas shouldn't be here at all, but you already knew that. And on that note, that wraps up all of the changes for this week's episode. So what do you think? When you saw the barrel scene, what were your first thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.